The salt spray stung their faces, a familiar caress that spoke of the sea's boundless power, yet on this day, it carried the sharp tang of anticipation, of destiny, poised on a blade's edge. Across the flat expanse of the field, a sea of banners unfurled, a tapestry woven from the faith and might of a united Ireland. Sunlight glinted off polished helms, the polished steel of mail shirts, the sharp points of spears held aloft by 1,000 hands. They marched with the unwavering stride of men who believed themselves invincible, a righteous host assembled under the banner of Christ, led by a high king whose legend was already etched in the annals of their nascent nation, Brian Boru. His name resonated with authority, with a hard-won peace that had been forged in the fires of ambition and the crucible of conflict. His army, a formidable coalition of Irish kingdoms and their Norse allies, those who had long since shed the wild marauder's skin for the settled merchant's trade and the warrior's honor, represented the zenith of Irish military power. They were confident, perhaps even a touch arrogant, their numbers swelling, their purpose clear, to crush the last vestiges of pagan defiance, to sweep away the persistent, disruptive force that had for centuries plagued their shores. The air thrummed with their resolve, a low guttural hum of marching feet and whispered prayers, a symphony of impending victory. They saw no shadows, no hidden dangers, only the open field, the enemy arrayed before them and the promise of a decisive triumph that would secure their dominion. They were the wave of the future, crashing against the shores of the past, and they believed that no earthly force, no cunning stratagem, could possibly turn the tide against them. Their faith was their shield, their numbers their sword, and the open ground their chosen arena for glory. They advanced towards the horizon, a shimmering mirage of power, utterly oblivious to the subtle, deadly currents that swirled beneath the placid surface of the landscape, currents that had been expertly laid, patiently waiting to ensnare them. The stage was set, not for a straightforward clash of arms, but for a meticulously crafted illusion, a theater of war where perception would be as deadly as any weapon. The enemy they faced was not merely a collection of disparate warriors, but a unified, cunning entity, one that understood the land, understood its adversary, and understood the primal, terrifying power of surprise. This was not just a battle. It was a testament to the enduring art of war, an art that predated Brian Boru's reign, an art that understood that victory was often achieved not by overwhelming force, but by the precise, devastating application of calculated deception. The very ground they marched upon held secrets, secrets that the assembled Christian host had failed to decipher, secrets that would soon become the instruments of their undoing. The story of Ireland, like many lands touched by the long arm of Norse expansion, is one of constant flux, of cultures clashing and coalescing, of pagan traditions wrestling with the ascendant light of Christianity. For centuries, the arrival of Viking longships had been a harbinger of both terror and transformation. These were not merely raiders. They were explorers, traders, settlers, and warriors who carved out kingdoms and left their indelible mark on the very fabric of Irish society. By the dawn of the 11th century, the landscape of Ireland was a complex mosaic of native Irish kingdoms, many of them vying for supremacy, and Norse settlements that had become integral, albeit sometimes volatile, parts of the island's political and economic life. Into this intricate web stepped Brian Boru, a chieftain from Munster who, through a combination of shrewd diplomacy, military prowess, and sheer force of will, had risen to become the High King of Ireland. His ambition was not merely to rule, but to forge a unified kingdom, to bring an end to the endemic warfare that had plagued the island for generations, and to establish a lasting peace under a single, strong authority. However, this vision of unity was not universally embraced, and the persistent presence of Norse power, particularly in the form of the Kingdom of Dublin, remained a significant challenge. Dublin, a thriving port city founded by Norse settlers, had evolved into a powerful entity in its own right, often acting as a bulwark against Irish domination, and frequently aligning itself with foreign powers, including the Norse kings of Orkney and the Isle of Man, and even drawing upon mercenary forces from across the Irish Sea. The year is 1014. Tensions had reached a boiling point. Brian Boru's ascendancy had ruffled many feathers, both among the Irish chieftains who chafed under his rule, and among the Norse lords who saw their influence waning. A grand alliance had been forged, a formidable coalition that aimed to break Brian Boru's power once and for all. This alliance was a potent mix. The Norse kingdom of Dublin, led by its formidable King Sigtrygg Silkbeard, a man whose lineage traced back to the great Norse sagas, had gathered a formidable fleet and an army comprised of seasoned Norse warriors and mercenaries from the Hebrides and Scotland. Alongside Dublin's forces stood the powerful Earl of Orkney, Sigurd Hlodverson, a Viking chieftain whose name was whispered with respect and fear across the northern seas, bringing with him a contingent of his own fierce warriors, renowned for their ferocity and their distinctive raven banners. The stage was set for a monumental confrontation, a battle that would decide the fate of Ireland. Brian Boru, sensing the magnitude of the threat, had rallied his own forces, a vast army drawn from across his kingdom and bolstered by loyal Norse allies who had integrated into Irish society and saw their own future tied to Brian's vision of a unified realm. This was not simply an Irish versus Norse conflict, it was a complex tapestry of alliances and rivalries, where loyalties were fluid and the lines between native and invader had long since blurred. The traditional narrative often paints this as a straightforward clash of civilizations, but the reality was far more nuanced. It was a struggle for dominion, for survival, and for the very soul of a nation in the making. The Christian army, confident in their numbers and the righteousness of their cause, prepared to meet their foes on the field of battle, unaware that their opponents had prepared not just a battlefield, but a meticulously crafted snare, a trap designed to exploit not only the terrain but also the very confidence of their advancing enemy. The battlefield, known to history as Clontarf, was not a simple open plain. It was a landscape that whispered secrets of ancient earthworks and tidal flows, a place where the land itself could become an ally or an enemy. The Christian army, a vast and gleaming host, advanced with a resolute stride, their eyes fixed on the enemy formations arrayed before them. They saw a formidable force, certainly, but one that was positioned in a manner that, to their experienced eyes, seemed almost predictable, even vulnerable. The Norse and allied forces, led by the formidable Sigurd of Orkney and the cunning Sigtrygg Silkbeard, though Sigtrygg himself would largely remain within Dublin, directing the naval aspects, had positioned their main strength along the coastline, their ships forming a formidable if somewhat static bulwark at sea. Their land forces, however, were arrayed in a manner that suggested a direct confrontation, a willingness to meet the advancing Irish and their allies head-on. The Christian army, comprising men from across Brian Boru's dominion, was a well-drilled force. Their core consisted of the professional warriors of Brian's own Memonian kingdom, supplemented by contingents from other Irish provinces, and crucially, a significant number of Norse warriors who had long since settled in Ireland and allied themselves with Brian. These Norse-Irish warriors brought with them their renowned fighting skills, their formidable axes, and their experience in close-quarters combat. The Christian army's formation was typical of the era, a strong center designed to hold the line, with flanks designed to either protect against envelopment or to pivot and counterattack. They were confident in their ability to break through the enemy lines, to engage in the brutal, bloody work of shield wall combat, and to overwhelm their opponents through sheer weight of numbers and the ferocity of their assault. The terrain, however, held a crucial, unseen advantage for the defenders. To the north of the main engagement area lay a series of marshes and boggy ground, areas that were notoriously difficult to traverse, especially for a heavily armored army. To the south, the coastline offered a natural barrier, but also potential for surprise. The Norse and allied forces, intimately familiar with this coastal landscape, had not simply chosen a defensive position, they had orchestrated a masterpiece of tactical deception. Their main force, arrayed in a seemingly straightforward battle line, was in fact a decoy, a lure designed to draw the Christian army into a specific kill zone. The true trap lay not in their frontal disposition, but in the subtle deployment of forces and the exploitation of the terrain's natural features. As the Christian army surged forward, their momentum carrying them onto the field, they were focused entirely on the enemy they could see, on the challenge directly before them. They failed to account for the unseen, for the forces that lay hidden waiting for the opportune moment. The timing was crucial. The attack was timed not just to coincide with the Christian advance, but to exploit the ebb and flow of the tide, the very rhythm of the sea that had brought the Norse to these shores. The deception was layered. The seemingly conventional battle line was the first layer, designed to lull the enemy into a false sense of security. The second layer was the subtle positioning of reserves, held back, out of sight, ready to pivot and strike. The third, and most deadly, was the exploitation of the terrain, the marshes to their flank, the coastline at their rear, and the carefully chosen ground that would funnel the enemy into a confined space. The Christian army, blinded by their confidence and their focus on the immediate threat, marched directly into the waiting maw of a trap that had been painstakingly prepared by warriors who understood that the greatest victories are often won not by the loudest roar but by the silent, deadly whisper of cunning. The moment the trap was sprung was not a singular, thunderous event, but a creeping, insidious unraveling of order that quickly descended into unadulterated chaos. As the Christian army advanced, their shield walls locking together with a resonant clang, they pushed forward with the expectation of a hard-fought but ultimately victorious engagement. They were met by the initial Norse and Allied lines, and the brutal, visceral work of battle began. Axes swung, swords clashed, and the air filled with the guttural roars of warriors and the sharp cries of the wounded. The Christian army, confident in their superior numbers and the strength of their formations, began to gain ground, pushing their opponents back towards the coastline. This was precisely what the architects of the trap had intended. As the Christian advance crested a slight rise, or pushed through a particularly dense knot of enemy resistance, the hidden elements of the Norse strategy were unleashed. From the marshy, treacherous ground to the north, a contingent of Norse warriors who had carefully navigated the bogs under the cover of the main engagement emerged. They did not charge headlong into the main Christian line, but instead attacked the exposed flank, the side that was not protected by shields and spears. This was the first fissure in the Christian formation. Simultaneously, the Norse forces that had been seemingly pushed back along the coast began to rally, not to form a defensive line, but to launch a series of coordinated counterattacks, targeting the now stretched and disordered Christian ranks. The carefully orchestrated timing meant that the Christian army found itself simultaneously assaulted from the front by the rallying enemy, from the flank by the hidden warriors from the marshes, and crucially, with their rear increasingly threatened by the Norse fleet that now began to press closer to the shore, launching volleys of arrows and attempting to land further troops to complete the encirclement. The psychological impact was devastating. What had begun as a confident advance rapidly devolved into a desperate struggle for survival. The ordered shield walls began to buckle under the relentless multi-directional assault. Warriors who had been focused on the enemy before them were suddenly forced to turn and defend their unprotected sides, creating gaps and confusion within their ranks. The sight of their flank being systematically dismantled, of their comrades falling to unseen enemies emerging from the very ground beneath them, shattered their morale. The unified, confident Christian army fractured. Units became isolated, surrounded, and cut off. The battle transformed from a test of martial strength into a brutal, chaotic melee, where survival depended on individual prowess and sheer luck, rather than the coordinated efforts of a cohesive army. The psychological warfare was as potent as the physical. The Norse warriors, renowned for their ferocity and their war cries, amplified the terror. The seemingly impossible terrain that had swallowed some of their own men now seemed to birth enemies, adding a layer of primal fear to the unfolding carnage. The Christian army, so sure of their victory, found themselves caught in a nightmare of their own making, a testament to the fact that the most terrifying enemy is often the one that anticipates your every move and uses the very environment against you. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Clontarf was a scene of unparalleled carnage. The field was a churned morass of mud, blood, and shattered weaponry. The Christian army, once a proud and unified host, was a broken and scattered remnant, their confidence shattered, their ranks decimated. The victory, however, was not a clean sweep for the Norse-aligned forces. While the trap had been devastatingly effective, inflicting immense casualties and disrupting the Christian advance, the battle itself had been a brutal, attritional affair. Many of the key Norse leaders, including the formidable Earl Sigurd of Orkney, had fallen in the thick of the fighting, their legendary prowess ultimately insufficient against the sheer ferocity and numbers of the Irish forces. Similarly, Brian Boru himself, the High King, met his end in his tent after the battle, slain by fleeing Norse warriors, a tragic end to a life dedicated to forging a unified Ireland. The consequences of Clontarf, therefore, were complex and far-reaching, defying simple categorization as a clear Norse victory or defeat. In the short term, the battle undeniably crippled the power of the Norse kingdom of Dublin and its foreign allies. The formidable coalition that had sought to challenge Brian Boru was shattered, their leadership decimated. The threat of large-scale Norse invasion and conquest in Ireland was significantly diminished. The victory, albeit a costly one for the Irish side, reinforced Brian Boru's vision of a unified Ireland, even if he did not live to see its full realization. The battle effectively marked a turning point in the relationship between the Norse settlers and the native Irish. While Norse influence would continue to be felt, particularly in the coastal cities, their ability to project independent military power on a grand scale across the island was severely curtailed. The Norse who remained in Ireland increasingly integrated into Irish society, their distinct political and military power waning, their culture becoming a hybrid element within the broader Irish tapestry. For the Christian forces, the immediate impact was one of profound loss. The cream of Irish soldiery, and many of their loyal Norse allies, lay dead on the field. The dream of a swift, decisive victory that would have solidified Brian Boru's reign and ushered in an era of unparalleled peace was tragically cut short by the High King's assassination. However, the long-term legacy was one of consolidation. The power vacuum left by the Norse defeat and Brian's death was eventually filled by his successors, who continued the work of unifying Ireland. The battle, despite the immense human cost, ultimately served to strengthen the foundations of a centralized Irish kingdom, paving the way for a more cohesive national identity. It proved that even the most formidable Norse military machine, when faced with cunning tactics and a united Irish front, could be broken. The myth of Norse invincibility in Ireland, while not entirely extinguished, was certainly tarnished. Clontarf, therefore, stands not as a simple tale of triumph or defeat, but as a pivotal moment where the tides of power shifted, where a meticulously crafted trap led to a battle of legendary ferocity, and where the future of Ireland was irrevocably shaped by the blood spilled on its shores. The echoes of Clontarf resonate not merely in the annals of military history, but in the very soul of Ireland, a testament to the enduring power of strategic brilliance and the brutal realities of warfare. This was not a battle won by divine intervention or the sheer force of faith alone, but by a deep understanding of the land, of human psychology, and of the art of deception. The Viking trap, a masterpiece of tactical execution, reminds us that true strength often lies not in brute force, but in cunning foresight. It highlights the timeless principle that an enemy's confidence can be their greatest vulnerability, and that the most devastating blows are often struck when least expected. The meticulous planning, the exploitation of terrain, the patient waiting for the opportune moment, these are the elements that transformed a seemingly conventional battle into a decisive, albeit costly, victory for the Norse-aligned forces. The battle underscores the complex interplay of cultures that defined early medieval Ireland. It was a period where the lines between native Irish and Norse settlers had blurred, where alliances were forged and broken based on shifting political landscapes and personal ambitions. Clontarf was not simply an Irish army fighting Vikings. It was a multifaceted conflict involving various Irish factions and Norse groups, each with their own agendas. The trap itself serves as a powerful metaphor for the hidden dangers that lie beneath the surface of seemingly stable situations. The Christian army, advancing with the assurance of righteous victory, was metaphorically marching into a dark forest, unaware of the snares laid by those who knew the woods intimately. This speaks to our own lives, where we often proceed with a clear vision of our goals, only to be blindsided by unforeseen obstacles or the machinations of others. The psychological impact of the trap, the sudden shift from confidence to chaos, the shattering of morale, is a stark reminder of the fragility of human order in the face of overwhelming pressure. It speaks to the primal fears that can be ignited when our sense of security is violently disrupted, when the predictable world gives way to a terrifying, unpredictable reality. The story of Clontarf forces us to confront the brutal pragmatizing of war. It strips away the romanticized notions of chivalry and heroism, revealing the raw, visceral struggle for survival that defined ancient and medieval combat. The bloodshed, the desperation, the ultimate cost in human lives. These are the undeniable realities that lie at the heart of any conflict. The long-term consequences, the reshaping of political power, the subtle shifts in cultural identity, the enduring impact on the land itself, all serve to remind us that battles, even those seemingly won or lost, have ripples that extend far beyond the immediate aftermath. They shape the destiny of nations and the course of history in ways that are often only fully understood generations later. The victory was not absolute, the defeat not total, but the event itself was a profound turning point, a moment when the trajectory of Ireland was irrevocably altered. And so the tale of Clontarf, of the Viking trap that ensnared a confident army, lives on not merely as a historical account, but as a profound lesson etched in the very landscape of Ireland and in the collective memory of its people. It is a story that whispers to us across the centuries, reminding us that victory is not always found on the open field, nor in the sheer might of one's legions. It speaks of the power of understanding your adversary, of knowing the terrain, and of the devastating efficacy of patience and deception. The Christian army, so sure of their path, so confident in their righteousness, marched into a carefully constructed illusion, a testament to the fact that the greatest advantage can lie in the unseen, in the meticulously planned ambush that exploits not only the physical environment, but also the psychological landscape of the enemy. This battle serves as a potent symbol for the enduring human struggle against unseen forces, against the hidden currents that can shape our destinies. It reminds us that progress, whether military, social, or personal, is rarely a straight line, and that the most formidable challenges often arise from the shadows, from the very ground we thought we knew. The complex tapestry of alliances and rivalries that defined that era, the blurring lines between cultures, offer a mirror to our own interconnected, often conflicting world. We see in the Norse settlers and the native Irish a reflection of the ongoing dance between tradition and change, between the established order and the disruptive forces that seek to reshape it. The psychological impact of the trap, the descent from confident advance to chaotic desperation, is a stark reminder of the fragility of order and the primal power of fear. It asks us to consider how easily our carefully constructed certainties can crumble when faced with the unexpected, and how crucial resilience and adaptability are in the face of overwhelming adversity. The brutal reality of the bloodshed, the sheer human cost of such encounters, compels us to reflect on the true nature of conflict. It is a stark counterpoint to any glorification of war, forcing us to confront the visceral suffering and the profound loss that lie at its heart. The legacy of Clontarf, therefore, is not one of simple triumph or defeat, but of a profound and enduring transformation. It is a story that teaches us that true wisdom lies in recognizing the unseen, in respecting the power of cunning, and in understanding that the greatest battles are often won before the first sword is drawn. As we stand on the precipice of our own challenges, the echoes of Clontarf call to us, urging us to look beyond the obvious, to anticipate the hidden, and to remember that the most effective strategies are often those that are whispered, not shouted, those that are woven into the fabric of the land itself. What unseen traps lie in wait for us on the fields of our own lives, and can we, like the cunning warriors of old, learn to read the land and anticipate the coming storm? The strategic brilliance of Clontarf, particularly the infamous Viking trap, offers a profound lens through which to examine the often overlooked psychological warfare inherent in ancient combat. Beyond the clash of steel and the roar of the battlefield, the Norse commanders understood that an enemy's mind could be as effectively subdued as their bodies. Consider the deliberate staging of their initial lines, not as a robust defense but as a carefully orchestrated bait. This wasn't merely about drawing the enemy forward, it was about cultivating a specific emotional response within the advancing Christian host. Their burgeoning confidence, their certainty of impending victory, was meticulously nurtured. This psychological priming made the subsequent multi-pronged assault all the more devastating. When the hidden contingents emerged from the marshes, and the coastal forces executed their feigned retreat and counterattack, the Christian warriors were not just facing a tactical shift, they were experiencing a profound epistemic shock. Their established understanding of the battle, their very perception of reality on that field, was violently upended. This is where the true genius of the trap lay. It didn't just break their formations, it shattered their certainty. The psychological fallout of this betrayal of expectation is immeasurable. Warriors who believed they were on the verge of triumph suddenly found themselves disoriented, their strategic assumptions invalidated. This disorientation breeds panic, and panic, as any seasoned commander knows, is a far more potent weapon than any axe or spear. Furthermore, the timing of the trap synchronized with the natural rhythms of the coast. The tide, the visibility, the very patterns of movement that the Norse had mastered over centuries of seafaring and coastal warfare, served a dual purpose. Tactically, it maximized the element of surprise and the effectiveness of the pincer movement. Psychologically, however, it amplified the sense of overwhelming, almost supernatural opposition. To the Christian army, it must have seemed as though the very elements were conspiring against them. The marshes, previously an obstacle, became a source of unseen enemies. The familiar coastline, a theater of betrayal. This perceived alignment of natural forces with the enemy's strategy would have instilled a deep sense of dread, a feeling of fighting against an overwhelming, almost divinely ordained tide. This is a critical layer often missed in historical analyses that focus solely on troop movements and weaponry. The Norse commanders were not just tacticians. They were masters of manipulating the emotional and psychological state of their opponents, turning the battlefield into a theater of terror where perception was weaponized. Building on this, the subsequent integration of the Norse fleet into the trap's execution added another dimension of psychological pressure. The threat from the sea, the arrow volleys raining down from ships that were seemingly part of the initial defensive posture, but then became instruments of encirclement, created a suffocating sense of inescapable doom. Imagine being a warrior, locked in brutal combat, aware of the enemy pressing in from your front and flank, and then realizing that your rear, your escape route, is also being systematically closed off by forces operating with chilling coordination. This multi-directional assault, amplified by the psychological impact of the terrain and the fleet's involvement, created a vortex of despair. It wasn't just about being outnumbered or outmaneuvered. It was about experiencing a complete breakdown of tactical and emotional equilibrium. The Christian army, stripped of its confidence and its strategic bearings, was left vulnerable to the most primal of instincts, the desperate fight for survival. This intricate orchestration of tactical superiority with profound psychological manipulation is what elevates Clontarf from a mere battle to a masterclass in ancient warfare, demonstrating that the most decisive victories are often won not just on the field, but within the minds of the combatants. The immediate aftermath of Clontarf, a scene etched in the collective memory of Ireland, was far more than just a tally of the fallen or a shift in political power. It represented a profound redefinition of warfare itself, particularly for the Norse settlers, who had long prided themselves on their martial prowess and their ability to project power across the sea. The very nature of their military engagements shifted. Prior to Clontarf, Viking raids and battles often revolved around direct face-to-face confrontations, emphasizing individual heroism and the shock value of a sudden, overwhelming assault. However, the success of the Clontarf trap demonstrated the immense strategic value of understanding and manipulating the environment, moving beyond mere battlefield tactics to encompass a more holistic approach to warfare. This wasn't simply about fighting on land, it was about fighting with the land using its inherent features, the treacherous marshes, the shifting coastlines, the very weather, as active participants in the conflict. Consequently, the Norse military doctrine, already sophisticated, began to incorporate a deeper appreciation for terrain analysis and the strategic advantage of unconventional approaches. Furthermore, the experience at Clontarf catalyzed a subtle, yet significant evolution in Norse military intelligence and reconnaissance. The ability of Brian Boru's forces, including their integrated Norse allies, to anticipate and counter the seemingly impenetrable Norse strategy, underscored a critical lesson. Information was as vital as any weapon. The Norse, accustomed to being the initiators of surprise, found themselves on the receiving end of a meticulously planned counter-ambush. This experience likely fostered a greater emphasis on scouting, on understanding the enemy's disposition, their alliances, and their strategic intentions, rather than solely relying on the shock of their own arrival. Imagine the debriefing sessions, the grim acknowledgments of how a perceived weakness in the Christian army's deployment was, in fact, a calculated lure, and how the very ground they stood upon became their undoing. This realization would have spurred a more diligent approach to gathering intelligence about potential adversaries and the locales in which future engagements might take place. Conversely, and perhaps more critically, the battle forced a recalibration of the Norse perception of their own invincibility. While their warrior culture celebrated courage and ferocity, Clontarf exposed the limitations of relying solely on these admirable traits. The defeat, or at least the significant cost of the engagement for the Norse-aligned forces, served as a stark reminder that even the most seasoned warriors could be outmaneuvered and overwhelmed by superior strategy. This didn't diminish their warrior ethos but rather refined it, infusing it with a greater respect for tactical depth and the understanding that brute force, while necessary, was not always sufficient. The psychological impact of realizing their meticulously laid plans had been countered, and that their own fearsome reputation had been turned against them, would have instilled a newfound humility. This reevaluation of their military identity, moving from pure shock and awe tactics to a more nuanced blend of environmental exploitation and psychological warfare, laid the groundwork for future military adaptations, ensuring that their reputation as formidable warriors was tempered with an enduring respect for the art of strategic thinking. The profound strategic revelation gleaned from Clontarf wasn't merely about how the Norse fought, but why their approach, while formidable, had inherent limitations that Brian Boru's forces, with their deeper integration into the island's socio-political fabric, could exploit. Consider the Norse reliance on a more transient, mercenary-driven force, particularly the contingents from the Hebrides and Scotland. While these warriors were undoubtedly skilled and ferocious, their loyalty was often transactional, tied to immediate plunder or the promise of future spoils. This contrasts sharply with the core Irish levies, whose commitment was often rooted in a more complex web of kinship, territorial defense, and fealty to a high king like Brian, who was actively working to forge a unified, stable kingdom. The trap at Clontarf, while successful in its immediate execution, ultimately highlighted this fundamental difference in motivation. The Norse leaders, Sigurd of Orkney and the Dublin contingent, were fighting for dominance and prestige, but the individual mercenary might have been fighting for survival and immediate gain. This disparity in commitment meant that when the trap began to unravel, when the initial promise of victory turned into a brutal, attritional struggle with heavy casualties, the mercenary element, lacking the deeper ideological or territorial investment, would be the first to falter, to seek escape or to simply cease fighting. Now think about how this dynamic plays out in any large-scale conflict. Units driven by a deep-seated cause, by a belief in the righteousness of their struggle or the defense of their homeland, often exhibit a higher degree of tenacity and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds than those motivated purely by pay or the promise of loot. The Norse, in essence, were fighting a war of conquest and influence while Brian's forces were defending a nascent nation and its established order. This fundamental difference in purpose created an inherent vulnerability within the Norse alliance, a fragility that, once exposed by the well-executed trap, led to its ultimate fragmentation. Furthermore, the very concept of Norse military identity at Clontarf was not monolithic. By 1014, the Norse presence in Ireland had evolved significantly from the initial raiding parties. Many had settled, intermarried, and adopted aspects of Irish culture and governance. This internal diversification meant that the Norse force at Clontarf was a composite entity, a blend of more traditional Norse warriors, hardened mercenaries, and assimilated Norse-Irish, who likely held allegiances that were not solely defined by their Scandinavian heritage. This internal complexity, while offering a broader range of fighting styles and tactical options, also introduced potential fault lines in command and control. Imagine the communication challenges, the differing priorities between a Norse earl from Orkney, the King of Dublin with his established kingdom, and mercenary captains whose primary concern was the safety of their own men and the fulfillment of their contracts. The trap, while brilliantly conceived, relied on a degree of unified execution that may have been difficult to maintain across such a heterogeneous force, especially when faced with unexpected resistance or when the initial promise of swift victory turned into a protracted bloodbath. This is akin to modern military operations where diverse allied forces must be carefully coordinated. Differences in doctrine, language, and strategic objectives can always present challenges, even with the most brilliant tactical plans. The success of the trap, therefore, was not just a testament to Norse cunning, but also an indicator of the specific vulnerabilities that arose from their evolving, composite military structure in Ireland. A crucial layer of understanding, often overlooked in the dramatic narrative of the battle, lies in the strategic implications of the Norse fleet's role. While the land-based trap was devastating, the naval component was equally vital, acting not just as a passive presence but as an active instrument of psychological and tactical pressure. The fleet's ability to maneuver along the coastline, to launch volleys of arrows into the exposed flanks of the Christian army, and to potentially land fresh troops to complete the encirclement, transformed the battlefield into a three-dimensional kill zone. This wasn't merely about controlling the sea lanes, it was about leveraging naval mobility to dictate the terms of engagement on land. Consider the psychological impact of knowing that escape by sea was not guaranteed, that the very element that had brought their enemies to their shores now served as a barrier to their own retreat. This created a sense of claustrophobia, of being boxed in by both land and sea. Moreover, the fleet's actions likely served to disrupt any potential Christian reinforcements arriving by water, further isolating the engaged forces. This integrated approach, where naval power was not a separate theater of war but a direct extension of the land battle's strategy, represented a sophisticated understanding of combined arms warfare that was ahead of its time. The trap at Clontarf, therefore, was not just a clever ground maneuver. It was a testament to a holistic military doctrine that recognized the synergistic potential of land and sea forces working in concert to achieve a singular, devastating objective. This integration of naval power into the execution of a land-based ambush highlights a level of strategic foresight that transcends simple battlefield tactics, demonstrating a comprehensive approach to warfare that exploited every available resource and environmental advantage. The strategic brilliance of Clontarf, particularly the Viking trap, wasn't merely about battlefield tactics. It illuminated a crucial aspect of pre-modern warfare, the immense psychological leverage derived from exploiting an enemy's perceived invincibility. For centuries, the Norse reputation preceded them, a storm of steel and fury that had carved empires and sown terror across continents. This fearsome image was in itself a weapon, often demoralizing opponents before the first clash of shields. However, at Clontarf, Brian Boru's forces, drawing upon a deep understanding of their adversaries and the local terrain, systematically dismantled this aura of invulnerability. The trap wasn't just a physical enclosure, it was a psychological cage. By orchestrating a scenario where the seemingly unstoppable Norse advance was not only halted, but systematically dismantled by unseen forces and environmental hazards, the Christian defenders struck at the very core of their opponent's self-belief. This wasn't simply about winning a battle. It was about shattering an ingrained psychological paradigm. Now consider how this applies when you face a challenge that seems overwhelmingly powerful. Often the fear of that power is more debilitating than the power itself. The victory at Clontarf, therefore, wasn't just a military triumph. It was a profound psychological victory, demonstrating that even the most formidable reputations can be undermined by clever strategy and a deep understanding of an opponent's psychological vulnerabilities. Furthermore, the effectiveness of the trap also underscored the evolving nature of military leadership. The Norse commanders, while undoubtedly skilled warriors, seemed to operate within a more traditional framework of battlefield command, relying on the direct application of force and the visible deployment of their strength. Brian Boru's leadership, however, demonstrated a more nuanced approach, one that embraced indirect strategy, deception, and the exploitation of intelligence. This wasn't just about leading from the front. It was about leading from a deeper understanding of the entire strategic landscape. The trap required foresight, patience, and a willingness to operate outside the conventional norms of direct confrontation. This strategic depth, the ability to think several steps ahead and to anticipate the enemy's reactions, is what allowed Brian's forces to turn the Norse reputation for ferocity into a liability. It highlights a critical distinction: the difference between being a formidable fighter and being a masterful strategist. The success at Clontarf wasn't solely due to the bravery of the Irish warriors, but to the strategic acumen of their leaders who understood that the most decisive victories are often won not in the heat of direct combat, but in the meticulous planning that precedes it. This emphasis on strategic thinking over brute force is a timeless lesson, applicable even in modern contexts where technological superiority can be nullified by clever, unconventional tactics. Another crucial layer is the subtle but significant impact of local knowledge versus external military doctrine. The Norse, despite their long presence in Ireland, often operated with a military mindset rooted in their Scandinavian traditions, a doctrine honed on different terrains and against different adversaries. The Christian army, however, comprised men who were intimately familiar with the specific nuances of the Clontarf battlefield. They understood the hidden paths through the marshes, the treacherous currents along the coast, the areas that would become waterlogged after rainfall, and the optimal times for movement under the cover of natural phenomena. This deep, almost intuitive understanding of the local environment provided a critical advantage. When the Norse forces, reliant on their established tactical manuals, advanced into this alien landscape, they were effectively stepping into a carefully prepared arena where every fold of the land was known and utilized by their adversaries. This illustrates a fundamental principle of warfare. Local knowledge can often trump external military doctrine. Consider how modern armies often struggle in unfamiliar terrain, their sophisticated equipment and training proving less effective when faced with adversaries who possess an intimate understanding of their operating environment. The Clontarf trap was, in essence, a victory of intimate local knowledge over a more generalized, external military approach, proving that the ground itself can be the most potent weapon in the hands of those who truly understand it. The very architecture of the Norse trap at Clontarf, beyond its immediate tactical brilliance, served as a profound, albeit unintentional, testament to the evolving nature of warrior ethos and its susceptibility to strategic manipulation. While the Norse warrior ideal was deeply rooted in concepts of individual valor, martial prowess, and the pursuit of glory through open combat, the Clontarf ambush subtly exposed the limitations of this traditional mindset when confronted by an adversary who understood its psychological underpinnings. The trap wasn't merely a physical entanglement. It was an existential challenge to the Norse warriors' fundamental understanding of honorable engagement. By forcing them into a chaotic, multi-directional melee, where the enemy emerged from unexpected quarters and the very ground seemed to conspire against them, the Christian forces stripped away the familiar context of a head-on clash. This denied the Norse warriors the opportunity to display their prowess in the manner they were accustomed to: the face-to-face duel, the shield wall confrontation, the clear demonstration of individual strength against a visible foe. Instead, they were thrust into a disorienting free-for-all, where survival often depended on reactive defense and awareness of threats from all sides, rather than the proactive, heroic charge. This shift in the nature of combat, from a celebrated test of individual mettle to a desperate struggle for survival in an environment of uncertainty, must have been profoundly unsettling, even demoralizing, for warriors whose identity was so intrinsically linked to the former. Furthermore, the strategic deployment of terrain as an active combatant, rather than merely a passive backdrop, introduced a critical element of unpredictability that directly challenged the Norse reliance on established martial doctrines. Their training and battle experience, forged on the plains of Scandinavia, the shores of Britain and other more conventional battlefields, likely emphasized formations and maneuvers optimized for relatively open terrain. The marshes and boggy ground at Clontarf, however, represented a tactical wildcard. The ability of the Christian forces to navigate these treacherous areas with relative ease, while simultaneously using them to conceal their movements and launch surprise attacks, demonstrated a mastery of environmental warfare that likely caught the Norse leadership off guard. This wasn't just about adapting to the terrain, it was about weaponizing it. For the Norse, accustomed to dictating the terms of engagement through their own martial prowess, being forced to fight on ground that actively worked against them, that seemed to swallow their formations and obscure their vision, must have felt like a profound affront to their military sensibilities. It highlighted a critical vulnerability. Their doctrine, while formidable in its own right, was perhaps too rigid, too dependent on predictable battlefield conditions, and insufficiently adaptable to the subtle, yet devastating power of localized environmental mastery. Building on this, the very composition of the forces involved at Clontarf reveals a deeper strategic nuance regarding the integration of disparate military elements. The Norse coalition was a complex amalgam, including not only warriors from the Scandinavian heartlands and their immediate island strongholds like Orkney and the Hebrides, but also the long-established Norse communities within Ireland, such as those in Dublin. Each of these contingents brought with them not only varying fighting styles but also, potentially, different levels of commitment and strategic objectives. While the earls and kings might have been driven by grand ambitions of conquest and political dominance, the individual mercenaries or warriors from assimilated Norse communities might have had more localized concerns, perhaps even alliances that extended to certain Irish factions. The trap's success, therefore, wasn't solely a product of Norse deception, but also an indication of the potential friction points within such a multifaceted alliance. When the meticulously planned ambush unfolded, and the initial promise of a swift, decisive victory dissolved into a brutal attritional struggle, these internal fissures would have been exacerbated. The warriors whose primary motivation was plunder might have become hesitant to risk their lives in a prolonged, uncertain conflict, especially when faced with an enemy that displayed an uncanny understanding of the battlefield and a relentless persistence. Consequently, the trap didn't just ensnare the Christian army, it also preyed upon the inherent vulnerabilities of a coalition that, while formidable in its collective might, may have lacked the cohesive ideological unity and shared purpose that characterized Brian Boru's more unified Irish forces. This complex interplay of external military doctrine, environmental exploitation, and the internal dynamics of alliances offers a rich tapestry for understanding the true strategic depth of Clontarf. The strategic brilliance of Clontarf, particularly the Viking trap, wasn't merely about battlefield tactics. It illuminated a crucial aspect of pre-modern warfare, the immense psychological leverage derived from exploiting an enemy's perceived invincibility. For centuries, the Norse reputation preceded them, a storm of steel and fury that had carved empires and sown terror across continents. This fearsome image was, in itself, a weapon, often demoralizing opponents before the first clash of shields. However, at Clontarf, Brian Boru's forces, drawing upon a deep understanding of their adversaries and the local terrain, systematically dismantled this aura of invulnerability. The trap wasn't just a physical enclosure, it was a psychological cage. By orchestrating a scenario where the seemingly unstoppable Norse advance was not only halted, but systematically dismantled by unseen forces and environmental hazards, the Christian defenders struck at the very core of their opponent's self-belief. This wasn't simply about winning a battle. It was about shattering an ingrained psychological paradigm. Now consider how this applies when you face a challenge that seems overwhelmingly powerful. Often the fear of that power is more debilitating than the power itself. The victory at Clontarf, therefore, wasn't just a military triumph. It was a profound psychological victory, demonstrating that even the most formidable reputations can be undermined by clever strategy and a deep understanding of an opponent's psychological vulnerabilities. Furthermore, the effectiveness of the trap also underscored the evolving nature of military leadership. The Norse commanders, while undoubtedly skilled warriors, seemed to operate within a more traditional framework of battlefield command, relying on the direct application of force and the visible deployment of their strength. Brian Boru's leadership, however, demonstrated a more nuanced approach, one that embraced indirect strategy, deception, and the exploitation of intelligence. This wasn't just about leading from the front. It was about leading from a deeper understanding of the entire strategic landscape. The trap required foresight, patience, and a willingness to operate outside the conventional norms of direct confrontation. This strategic depth, the ability to think several steps ahead and to anticipate the enemy's reactions, is what allowed Brian's forces to turn the Norse reputation for ferocity into a liability. It highlights a critical distinction: the difference between being a formidable fighter and being a masterful strategist. The success at Clontarf wasn't solely due to the bravery of the Irish warriors, but to the strategic acumen of their leaders who understood that the most decisive victories are often won not in the heat of direct combat, but in the meticulous planning that precedes it. This emphasis on strategic thinking over brute force is a timeless lesson, applicable even in modern contexts where technological superiority can be nullified by clever, unconventional tactics. Another crucial layer is the subtle but significant impact of local knowledge versus external military doctrine. The Norse, despite their long presence in Ireland, often operated with a military mindset rooted in their Scandinavian traditions, a doctrine honed on different terrains and against different adversaries. The Christian army, however, comprised men who were intimately familiar with the specific nuances of the Clontarf battlefield. They understood the hidden paths through the marshes, the treacherous currents along the coast, the areas that would become waterlogged after rainfall, and the optimal times for movement under the cover of natural phenomena. This deep, almost intuitive understanding of the local environment provided a critical advantage. When the Norse forces, reliant on their established tactical manuals, advanced into this alien landscape, They were effectively stepping into a carefully prepared arena where every fold of the land was known and utilized by their adversaries. This illustrates a fundamental principle of warfare. Local knowledge can often trump external military doctrine. Consider how modern armies often struggle in unfamiliar terrain, their sophisticated equipment and training proving less effective when faced with adversaries who possess an intimate understanding of their operating environment. The Clontarf trap was, in essence, a victory of intimate local knowledge over a more generalized, external military approach, proving that the ground itself can be the most potent weapon in the hands of those who truly understand it. The strategic revelation at Clontarf extends beyond mere tactical deception. It delves into the very essence of how information itself becomes a weapon, a critical element often underestimated in the brutal calculus of medieval warfare. While Norse armies were undoubtedly skilled in reconnaissance, their approach often focused on identifying enemy formations and assessing overt strengths. The success of Brian Boru's forces, however, hinged on a more sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation, one that penetrated deeper into the enemy's composition and motivations. Consider the potential for intelligence networks that extended not just to scouting enemy encampments, but to understanding the internal dynamics of their alliances. By recognizing the disparate loyalties within the Norse coalition, the difference between a committed Irish Norseman defending his established home and a mercenary from the Hebrides fighting for coin, Brian's strategists could anticipate points of fracture. This wasn't just about knowing where the enemy was, but why they were there, and how likely they were to hold their ground under duress. Now imagine the implications of this nuanced intelligence. It allows for the crafting of traps not just for the physical bodies of the enemy, but for their very cohesion. A trap designed to exploit the predictable breaking point of mercenary units, or to sow discord between allied factions, becomes infinitely more potent than one that relies solely on terrain and numbers. This sophisticated understanding of enemy psychology, informed by detailed intelligence, allowed Brian's forces to anticipate the ripple effects of their ambush, knowing that the initial shock would not only disorganize the front lines, but would also expose the underlying fragility of the Norse alliance. Building on this, the battle at Clontarf also serves as a compelling case study in the strategic advantage of cultural assimilation versus external imposition. The Norse, despite their centuries of presence in Ireland, often maintained a distinct cultural and military identity, viewing themselves as a separate, often superior entity. This external posture, while fostering internal Norse solidarity, simultaneously created a barrier to deeper integration and understanding of the native Irish landscape and its people. Conversely, Brian Boru's forces represented a more assimilated entity, a synthesis of Irish and Norse elements that had, over generations, developed a profound connection to the land and its specific challenges. This deep-rooted local knowledge, cultivated through generations of living and fighting on Irish soil, proved to be a decisive factor. It allowed Brian's commanders to anticipate how the Norse, with their potentially more rigid military doctrines, would react to unfamiliar terrain, and to subsequently engineer the trap to exploit these predictable responses. Think of it as the difference between a visitor trying to navigate a city using a tourist map and a lifelong resident who knows every shortcut, every hidden alley, and every potential bottleneck. The latter possesses an invaluable tactical advantage that transcends mere numbers or weaponry. This intimate familiarity with the environment, born from a deeper cultural integration, allowed Brian's forces to transform the battlefield itself into an extension of their strategy, rendering the Norse military expertise less effective in an alienating and unforgiving landscape. Another crucial layer to consider is the battle's impact on the evolution of military logistics and supply lines within Ireland. The scale of the forces assembled at Clontarf, both by Brian Boru and his Norse adversaries, necessitated significant logistical support. For the Norse, operating largely as an expeditionary force or drawing upon external alliances, their supply lines were inherently more vulnerable and dependent on seaborne transport. This reliance made them susceptible to disruption, a vulnerability that Brian's forces, with their more localized and integrated supply networks, could potentially exploit. While the trap itself was a tactical masterpiece, its ultimate effectiveness was underpinned by the ability of Brian's army to sustain its operations over a longer period, or to mobilize more rapidly when needed, due to their closer proximity to resources and their established routes of supply across the island. The Norse, on the other hand, faced the logistical challenge of maintaining a large, potentially transient army, far from their core power bases. This disparity in logistical resilience meant that even if the initial trap was successful, the Norse forces might have been less capable of sustaining a protracted campaign or recovering from significant losses, as their ability to replenish troops and supplies was inherently more precarious. Consequently, Clontarf wasn't just a victory of arms and strategy. It was also a demonstration of the often overlooked importance of robust logistical infrastructure in determining the ultimate outcome of large-scale conflicts. Reflecting on this journey so far, we stand at a vantage point where the intricate tapestry of events begins to reveal its deeper patterns. The echoes of the battlefield, once a cacophony of individual actions, now coalesce into a resonant hum, a testament to the convergence of forces far grander than the sum of their parts. We have witnessed not merely the clash of armies, but the intricate dance of perception and reality, where the very ground beneath one's feet could betray the most confident advance. The threads of strategy, woven with local knowledge and a profound understanding of human psychology, have demonstrated how the most formidable strengths can harbor unseen vulnerabilities, waiting to be expertly unfurled. As these insights intermingle, a more nuanced appreciation emerges for how the currents of history are shaped not only by overt power, but by the subtle, often invisible forces that govern decision-making and morale. The narrative arc, moving from the initial confidence of a unified host to the unraveling of their certainty, illustrates a fundamental truth about conflict. The most decisive victories are often those that sow doubt and confusion, transforming the battlefield into a theater of the mind as much as a theater of arms. The carefully orchestrated unraveling we have explored suggests a deeper understanding of the adversary's inner workings, moving beyond the superficial assessment of their numbers or weaponry to probe the very foundations of their resolve. This journey through strategic ingenuity and psychological manipulation has illuminated how the landscape itself, when understood intimately, can become an active participant, shaping the course of engagement in ways that transcend conventional military doctrine. The seeds of foresight, planted with patient deliberation, have blossomed into a complex interplay of environmental advantage and strategic deception, leaving us to contemplate the enduring power of thoughtful preparation. In light of these converging insights, the path toward a final understanding becomes clearer, not through a simple recap, but through an appreciation of how these distinct elements, the strategic deployment of terrain, the psychological manipulation of the enemy, the nuanced understanding of alliances, and the critical role of local knowledge, have interwoven to create a singular, impactful narrative. As we pivot towards the final reflection, consider how these seemingly disparate threads, when viewed collectively, form a coherent and powerful statement about the enduring principles of conflict and the subtle yet profound ways in which history is shaped. This cumulative effect, like the slow erosion of stone by water, leaves an indelible mark, prompting us to look beyond the immediate spectacle of battle to the deeper currents of human endeavor and strategic wisdom that truly dictate the course of events. The dust has settled, but the echoes of Clontarf continue to reverberate, not merely as a historical footnote, but as a profound testament to the enduring art of war, an art that transcends the crude exchange of blows and delves into the subtler realms of perception and psychology. What unfolded on that fateful day was more than a battle. It was a masterful orchestration of deception, a calculated unraveling of an enemy's confidence, and a stark illustration of how the very land can become the most formidable weapon in the hands of those who truly understand it. The Norse, so accustomed to their reputation as unstoppable forces, found themselves ensnared not by superior numbers or brute strength alone, but by a strategy that preyed on their assumptions, exploited their perceived strengths, and ultimately turned their own momentum against them. This enduring lesson whispers across the centuries that true power often lies not in the overt display of force, but in the unseen currents of foresight, in the patient cultivation of an adversary's overconfidence, and in the